Okay, let's get to the point here again. Bruce Lee and the racist Chinese that attacked him. Well, few people understand the fact of what's happening in that particular situation. Certainly, racism and prejudice have been in the society since there's been more than two people. And nobody gets along. People like to look at certain racial situations, but most wars have been fought against people of different religions or the same religion. It's amazing, even no matter how radical a religion is, they ultimately fight each other. The Muslims fight each other. The Christians have fought each other. As a matter of fact, they've annihilated each other. So this is very common when we come into peace. So, you pick the obvious target initially, which is usually someone of a different color, and then, of course, of a different sex. It's really easy to do that, and that's human nature, because human nature are very evil, plain and simple. It's not complicated. So what does that mean? It means the fact that if you look through history, you'll find out Genghis Khan didn't invade Europe or even the Middle East initially. He invaded all the people around him, killed all his neighbors and neighboring countries, which were people of the same race, to take what they had. That's how the world goes, and that's how it is today. Christians hate Christians, they fight each other. Muslims hate Muslims. There are different sects of everything, and they all hate each other and so forth. So to think that racism is strictly by someone's race, and even the term, is a fallacy to begin with. It's an easy one to look at, and also you can look at 300 years of enslavement of the blacks, and this pushes to a particular level. But the blacks helped enslave themselves. They captured other black tribes. They sold them to the Muslim Spanish traders. It goes on and on and on. So a lot of this was, to this day, a lot of black tribes count how they beat the other tribe and sold them into slavery. So this is the kind of goofiness of the world. And certainly people are prejudiced against them just because of their color. So we have to understand that. But we have to also understand that's kind of an imbecilic way of looking at the problem. We just don't like you because of this situation. And of course, that's what a very low-level person thinks. And unfortunately, this is carried on into many different things. But people just don't get along, period. You don't get along in your families and everything else. So first of all, the Chinese hated Bruce Lee. Now, I'm not talking about the average person, but the people in control didn't like him. They didn't like that he was arrogant, that he was good at what he was done, and that he had a lot of demands. He was coming, particularly in his going to make movies of a higher level, or martial arts movies, because he grew up in the movie industry in China because his father was an actor. And he was coming from and had done TV and wanted to be respected for that and wanted to be paid. And they didn't want to do that. So this already started problems. And who finances everything, and of course that's internationally, is generally the organized crimes in everything and permeates everything and owns everybody. So the triads, of course, were involved in the movie industry, which generated a lot of money and had fully control over it. Here comes in this guy, and they considered him not to be Chinese because apparently one of his relatives, which seemed to be under suspicion of exactly what nationality he was, but apparently his grandfather or something was of European extent. For many, many years, it's been thought, and of course, I'm assuming they did that because people have some pseudo respect for the Germans, that somebody in his family was German. But it comes out to be apparently that in his family, they traced a recent author has traced down his heritage, and apparently his grandfather was Dutch Jewish. And this probably was covered up because of the fact, and then of the hatred, and here we go, prejudice again of white people, because Jews generally are white people, that they didn't want to get it. So they changed that into the fact of doing that, and that's what his mother stated even to Bruce Lee's wife. So that's another confused area that we don't know. Apparently, when we get back into it, like everything, the truth comes out. But this disqualified him for being pure Chinese. And of course, this is very typical when you go back into heritage of looking for so-called purity. How long have you been, and so forth. I mean, this is what what happened in most of these racist societies. And the Orientals are very racist, particularly the Japanese, who have been known to hate anybody who's not Japanese. This goes back into their heritage. You could call them the Nazi Japanese, just like the Nazis. And of course, they would go back and look in heritage for hundreds of years. The Nazis would, to see where you go back, which is kind of a joke, because there's no such thing as a particular German because of the way Europe is. Not to mention the fact that Germans are not white people, and they never have been. And even the Germans never said they were white. They said they were Aryan, which is from the Middle East. And they basically go back to that whole bucket of Arabs or Middle Eastern people. They claim they're not Arabs or whatever. It doesn't matter. They're from the Middle East, and you're grasping at straws trying to define that. But that's for another issue. But the point is that they didn't respect him because he wasn't fully Chinese. Apparently, this was well known for whatever reason. I don't know how that became well known, but apparently people knew this in his family, that part of that that he had some sort of European blood, and now it's apparently Dutch. So the whole idea is that he was then stated that he, first of all, couldn't be taught kung fu when he went to different schools and martial arts, and was persecuted in school by the other Chinese because of this. Well, isn't that interesting? So apparently, this has been reported in many different specials, that he was taunted, that the children constantly attacked him, and that he developed his, quote, fighting skills young because he had to defend himself, because the other Chinese kids persecuted him. You get that? I think that's very, very interesting. So, who was the big racist against Li? Were his own people. So, this is exactly what happened. This further came up, and if you read different documentaries and books about him, that when the Chinese, when he was in America, stating how great he was, that the Chinese sent representatives over, supposedly there was some big fight. Which of course has never been recorded, never repeated, and that he had no right to claim that he was a martial artist because he was not Chinese, and further, that it was against the Chinese tradition, you could say against Chinese law, so to speak, that you train non-Asians in martial arts. This wasn't done. It was against the tradition, and this goes on even today, of the fact that you may go to a school, but they're not going to teach you the full actual tradition. They're going to teach you bits and pieces of it, and they always hold something back. So in Empty Force, this is, I believe, I'm trying to remember the author's name in Empty Force, but he talks about this in his book, saying that, we're not really sure that this is good for Westerners. They don't have the patience, they don't have the mentality to really learn higher martial arts. And will they actually giving you the facts here? Well, I say they're not. They're lying to you, and they're not giving you the full story. And you, as a, quote, outsider, whatever that may be, will never learn the full system from any Asian person because they're going to hold that back. That's the way life is in anything. So if you go and train in the voodoo tradition and you're a white person, well, you're not going to get the same information that a person of color gets. It's just the way it is. I mean, I don't know why people somehow think this is weird. I've seen this happen throughout life. There's a whole class system, particularly within so-called white society. What school did you go to? Where are your parents from? If you come from a city, if you're from New York, well, you're a slob. If you have a certain backgrounds. So there's all this going. And if you don't have the right schools, you don't dress the right way, you're ostracized by white society, and you're not let up through that. Now, I personally experienced these things, so to think that there is some sort of universal whiteism that everybody is treated wonderful is nonsense. And the fact that only whites are supported in certain areas. Well, if you look into that, you'll probably find out there's a much deeper hole there. Most likely, if a corporation has a lot of white males there, that those males probably all went to the same school. They all came from the same economic background. They may have come from the same state. But you can guarantee that there's a universality there. They're not hiring a guy that has low-level education just because he's white. And even if he has high-level education, if he's not from your class, you're not going to do that. Now, people need to wake up with this stuff. I'm sick and tired of the ignorance out there that of this type of things. It's just not true. Of this club that only takes care of it. Yes, it's easier to get into places, but it doesn't mean you get anywhere. And to a certain extent, now it's fashionable to have non-whites. So you're going to have non-whites in all sorts of places that you would normally find people who are better qualified for. So this goes on and on. So the bottom line is that Bruce Lee had a great racial prejudice against him by his own people. This extended to the fact that they didn't like his entire attitude. They didn't really consider him to be Chinese either, and they started poisoning him, and ultimately the triads murdered him because they couldn't control him. They knew that he'd run home to Hollywood, make lots of money, and the triads would see nothing from it. That's what happened, and of course that's why they murdered him under this fake pretenses. So the point is they try and keep... basically he was a guy that was in great condition, didn't seem to suffer from any problems in the United States. All of a sudden he goes over to China, he starts to have these problems. They tried to blame drugs and everything else on him, and we just don't know. They did find cannabis in his system, supposedly, but, I don't believe any report from anybody. Whatever the Chinese coroner stated, he was told to state that, and you can guarantee whatever he wrote down was told him to write down. So if you think they're somehow independent, you don't know anything about the real world, particularly China at that time, where the corruption is unspeakable high levels of corruption, as they still are today. So that's what happened to him, and again, the Chinese sent people over to fight him because he was teaching non-Chinese martial arts, and that he wasn't even allowed to teach that as a general rule. Secondly, he wasn't even Chinese, so he couldn't hold the titles that he wanted to hold. That's the facts behind all of it. When we look at racism in Hollywood, which people want to point up that he didn't get kung fu, and this was because of racism, is so ignorant, it isn't even funny. So I've went over this in other things as well, but the point is that he was given a lot of breaks in Hollywood while a whole bunch of other people weren't. Why did they choose him for Kato? There certainly there's a lot of other martial arts guys and stuntmen they could have put in there. Now, the bottom line is that was part of the Green Hornet story and everything else. But the whole idea is that he got that break. He got that part. He got other parts. The fact that he didn't shoot up in stardom, well, we can go and talk about people not shooting up in stardom by the thousands. I lived in the Los Angeles area near Hollywood and knew hundreds of people trying to get into Hollywood that never made it. There's also well-known people that can't get their projects published. They can't get the money to produce the films they want. They write endlessly and nobody buys their scripts. So all of this is very common in Hollywood, and to think that somehow he should be special, and a lot of them are very talented. I've seen amazing singers and rock bands and everything else that you never heard of again that really are much better than all the stuff that came out. This is the nature of almost any industry. The fact is, he came over here, used his past acting abilities, played the wise Asian guy, and got his breaks. He was smart. He opened up schools. He learned philosophy so he could speak like he knew something. Very, very smart. And was very eclectic and used this and everything. So he's very, very smart and certainly a very highly evolved and martial artist. I mean, this guy was a master. There's no doubt about it. Now, how great of a fighter he would have been one-to-one is really unknown, and it's unfortunate that that wasn't kind of... But does that have any value to anybody? That's a macho, stupid thinking. So... the fact is that it doesn't matter how good he is. How good is his system that he can teach to you, and how can you reproduce it? And people don't get that. So this is all part of what's going on. But he got lots of breaks. Now, he didn't get the big movie break. Neither did a whole bunch of guys. I can tell you a guy that I knew who actually got a little movie deal. And then was never seen again, because his movie didn't do too well. And that goes for hundreds of people. The movie didn't do too well, people didn't like him, and they just throw you in the trash. That is Hollywood. So the fact that he was able to do as well as he did, and then he could go over to China, to Hong Kong, and they would give him a break. And of course, you have to follow through with it. He was a master on the screen. He looked great. He projected what everybody wanted, the macho fighter to protect yourself, your family, and others. And of course, this goes down to the root of everyone, because generally everybody is being inflicted upon some sort of horrible racism in one way or another, meaning you're put upon, whether you're small, fat, or whatever. And of course, racism or prejudiced or just being treated like garbage. Is there a word for that? Well, that's what society does to everybody, unless you have money or in social position, etc. So this is exactly what happened there. So the bottom line is that here's a guy that was in excellent physical condition. There's talk about a back condition, which his wife has reaffirmed that he did. That he seriously hurt his back, and they didn't think he would be able to walk again, and certainly not do martial arts. Through his extreme dedication, he was able to apparently, if the story is true, I've heard things that it's not true. But of course, this is what his wife stated and has been stated almost everywhere. That he healed his back condition and was able to come back. Now, healing it and being able to function, he may have been in horrible pain from that point on and may have been using certain drugs. Apparently, he was using marijuana, so they claim. But again, how can we know any of this stuff? And he wouldn't have talked about this stuff to anybody, because marijuana was a huge devil drug back in the times that he had his back problem. And I'm sure he didn't want to take barbiturates or pain pills because they are very debilitating. So you can't function well. They don't make you feel good. So he probably was using marijuana, which again, at his time there in the 60s and 70s, and Hollywood in general, was very readily available. So he may have been smoking quite a bit of that. We just don't know. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And we all know now that marijuana basically is an okay drug and has medical uses. So there's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's been demonized for profit again. Now that it's legalized almost all of the United States, and medically as well in many places around the world, everyone knows how a helpful medication this is. So, but the bottom line is that that's the people. So they sent a guy over from China to fight him, supposedly in Seattle area, and this went on. Of course, both sides claim victory. The same old story with this stuff, but they did that because he should not be teaching and he was not Chinese. So who's the racist here? Hollywood opened the doors, gave him big parts. I mean, to get the part as Cato is a huge thing to have in that particular time, that he was given that part. So he certainly wasn't disrespected. To give him a starring role that would have encompassed a lot of dialogue in that particular period of time. But of course, it's never happened again. So there hasn't been any shows out there that are martial arts in general. So to think that that was going to happen then, or would even happen now, as we can see even in this day and age, we're still getting people are not getting the Asian parts that they should. This happened, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, with Doctor Strange, and I listened to the director and why he did this. So he appointed a white British woman who looks like a man to be the great Asian wisdom person. In the Doctor Strange, I forget again the name of that person who did that. But again, it's on there. It sits right out of director's mouth. Don't tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. It's right there. Find out for yourself. So talk about a disgrace that people should be screaming about. That's what they ought to be screaming about, is that overlooking that and taking someone who was in the comic books as a particular Asian person, who was the wisdom master there, whatever the name is, and turning that into a white woman is pretty insulting. So the whole idea is that He got lots of breaks. He then became a giant because, he went to Hong Kong and told them he was Mr. Hollywood, and that's how he got parts. Of course, he followed through and impressed everybody. But the bottom line, he became too big for his britches, so to speak. He wasn't going to be controlled, and they ultimately poisoned and killed him, and nobody cares about it. This was then taken further as the triads worked their way into, and of course, they're all over the world, to kill his son, because that's how it's done. Because he refused to do it. So, get that clear, people. His own people murdered him. His own people threatened him. This is who the prejudiced people are. People think that for some reason it's only white people. Well, you haven't lived very well. The Japanese are notorious, hateful racists that have been murdering people for hundreds of years. Thousands of years, I should really say. So the whole idea is that this is certainly nothing new. The Chinese, like most cultures, are Chinese-centric. They think they're the best. They've done everything. You hear this from everybody. So the point is that it's ironic that people would only look at that and think that so-called only white people, whatever that is, and then, of course, they would wear the symbol of basically Arabs and use the term white power and equate that with Hitler, who was an Arab who came from the Middle East, is even a further insult. And I'm going to do a little lecture on what white people are. People need to understand where that so-called comes from. So certainly doesn't come from Middle Europe and those people who claimed of some sort, they claim to be Aryans. And look up where Aryans come from. So it's not really critical there to think that it's not true. So again, but that's typical of racists, or kind of the screwiest dumb idiots on the planet, to claim Arabs as being white. It's amusing. So whatever you want to say good or bad about Arabs, they're Arabs. They're not what are considered Nordics, etc., which are generally considered that. And of course, originally, so-called white people came from different areas, and it's again very provable by the drawings and pictures we have of people like Caesar, the Greeks, the Celts, and other people who are really where white people come from. They certainly have nothing to do with, quote, Deutschlanders or Germans who are non-whites. So all of that is kind of amusing, and of course all part of this confusion of what is going on. So as usual, I'm sure I've confused a lot of people with the facts. Facts are very confusing for most people. They don't do any research. They don't look into anything. They don't understand stories. They look at some gross thing that... Okay, sorry for that little interruption, but the point is people need to get the facts here and stop just acting like imbecilic morons that people are screaming racism, etc. He did pretty good. His family is rich today because of his work and his books. His son made a lot of money in the movies. So did his daughters, and they're still making money from his name. So, the fact that he wasn't a bigger star now, well, he died too young, first of all. Who knows what he would have been able to do if he wasn't murdered by his own Chinese. Who knows where that could have went. But I think, he was also premature in the big martial arts stuff. Now, could he have come to America and become a star? Well, nobody else was able to do it very well. Steven Seagal petered out, made a few movies. Chuck Norris is the same thing. Well, none of these people became superstars. Von Damme, etc. All these, quote, white people, well, they didn't become superstars. They had some amount of fame. They've done okay for themselves. I'm assuming that Bruce Lee would have been able to pull off the same thing. To give him more respect from that, to think that somehow the public is going to open their wallets and pay money to it, well, I just don't get it. I don't get the super interest in martial arts when there's really very little out there to do with that, particularly in the media. Other than MMA, mixed martial arts, Other than that, which is a pretty big industry right now, I mean, where are they? They don't have TV shows. They don't have movies. There isn't even very many reality shows. Nobody's following anybody around. They did it with Von Damme for 6 episodes, and that's all it was. And it was a fake little reality show put together. A point is, nobody's doing that. Chuck Norris has made his fame on a TV show that he did for many, many years. And that caught on mostly because it was free. And it wasn't all that martial artist. And Chuck Norris turned out to be kind of a right-wing Christian nutjob. So the whole idea certainly didn't perpetrate Oriental philosophy, and is a huge writer in the Christian field. For all that, for whatever that means. But, certainly I wouldn't call him a superstar or any other martial artist. There's a huge interest in martial arts of learning it and doing it, but there seems to be very little interest in actually media coverage of it. People talk about the ninja craze in the 80s. Sho Kanagi only made 2 movies. I mean, what is that? And certainly these are all made by Canon Films, who makes a lot of very B movies that never really were much of anything. They weren't Hollywood film, and there's no Hollywood movie star who is known for his martial arts. And certainly none of them are known for their acting, other than, surprisingly, Von Damme. One of the goofiest ones, who did some very dramatic, fine acting in the last 5 years in some very dramatic pictures. But action pictures in general don't seem to be all that popular anymore. I'm not sure what is. Get your facts straight here. Understand that the racism that Lee was subjected to was by his own Chinese people.